I'm going to discuss my background in a high-demand religion. There were a number of formal and informal expectations in the religion I grew up in, this high-demand religion. People were expected to pay 10% tithe, but it didn't stop at tithe. You're expected to pay somewhere between 3 and 5% additional money to help with local church expenses. Then the regional administrative office was supposed to get about another 1 to 2% of your annual income. And the world budget, well, that was supposed to take about 1 to 3% of your income. While tithe was the only formal requirement, the others were strongly encouraged. And if you added all that stuff up, people would be giving somewhere between 15 and 20% of their income if they followed the recommended donation rates. It went beyond just the amount of money you were supposed to donate. Generally, the sense was you could never do enough to serve God. You could never do enough to serve the church. In many of the smaller churches, people just didn't get paid for what they did. In fact, the janitors were usually volunteer. The people who taught Sunday school were volunteer. The musicians, the choir directors were all volunteer. And basically, the only person who got paid was the minister. And in some churches where the minister wasn't able to be there very often, the sermons were given by lay people. And as a general rule, the lay people giving the sermons received no remuneration for speaking. There was another unwritten sense of expectation. The general expectation was that if you had children and you were close enough to a church school, that your kids should be attending the school that the denomination owned. And when your children got old enough, that they should go to the denominationally owned college and graduate there. In the college that I attended, the impression I got was that if you were headed into service for the church, that this was the ultimate, that the goal of every student when they graduated should be to somehow work for the church denomination. And if you didn't work for the church denomination when you graduated, you might be treated a bit like a second-class citizen. There's a Bible passage that some lay people really like to quote, and quoted frequently. Matthew 5:48, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father, which is in heaven, is perfect." Some of these lay people seem to support the idea that it was possible to live without any sin, that God expected it and God demanded it, and we would, at the end of time, be expected to live without committing any sins. Fortunately, I don't recall any clergy making that point, but lay people frequently did in the area where I lived, so there was a sense of perfectionism in the church that in some communities was fairly strong. And for people who grew up feeling a bit perfectionistic just because of who they were, then that made it much more difficult because they had religious perfectionism to deal with in addition to their own perfectionism. For me, this was kind of a toxic combination. And then, of course, the question which I was asked was, and how did you cope with that? One way I coped was by leaving the denomination, so I wouldn't go home and spend all week kind of getting over some of the stuff that bothered me. I left the denomination. It allowed me to turn off those voices of self-condemnation that I heard so frequently in church. I learned to adopt more holistic and healthy theology. And there are other things that I do. I meditate, I recite self-affirmations, and I accept the fact that my body is a carrier for the Spirit of God, which means that I am a God carrier. And I remind myself that I need to treat myself with dignity and respect because I am a God carrier.